Have you seen the Lego movie? There's this scene where Princess Unikitty, the unicorn cat thing, goes into this business meeting with a bunch of robots. She still has her rainbow outfit and big unicorn horn, but she added a little tie and glasses on top, and she starts talking and just says, business, 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 numbers. Then whispers, is this working? And cheers when one of the robots says yes. This is what I think of when I think about masking. I think that pretty much sums up how I feel walking into a place where I feel like I need to mask or I don't belong. And thankfully, I almost never need to do that these days. But for decades, I was living this life and it's exhausting.
Okay, so I have seen that scene, even though I haven't seen the whole movie. And it's been on my list for like 10 years, literally, because everybody says it's actually a really good movie. But anyways, yes, that is definitely how masking has felt for me too. You're like stepping into this role and you're not sure if you're pulling it off. You're like, literally, like in that scene, it's like, is it working?
Yeah.
And it's
Yes.
exhausting.
Right. And so if you have no idea what we're talking about, check the show notes for a link to the clip.
After our episode on being neurodivergent as adults, we got some great follow-up questions on masking and what it is and why it happens and if it's always bad or how to support unmasking and if it's for specific neurodivergent diagnoses or not. So today we're going to kind of unmask masking. Welcome to Parenting Neurodivergent Humans. I'm Dr. Morgan Beidelman. I am a clinical psychologist, former school psych, former teacher, neurodivergent myself, and parent to 2 humans, one of whom is neurodivergent.
And I'm Breann Colpitts. I'm a school psychologist turned social coach for twice exceptional kids. I'm a mom to a couple neurodivergent kids and a late realized ADHD human, which means I'm double blessed with autism and ADHD. Thanks for being here. We're so glad you're here.
So first off, what is masking? One of the ways to think about it is to think of it as if you're like playing a part instead of doing what feels natural to you. It just like kind of feels like you're being in a character. And I also think of it as like having anxiety around it. A while ago, one of my colleagues and I had to go to this event, and there's just like a ton of small talk at this event, or at any event, really, probably. And I avoid those like the plague because basically the things that I talk about are like education, psychology, gardening. I have like a very like niche amount of things that I like to talk about for a long period of time. And then after that, I'm like, how's the weather? And I got so anxious that I had to stop at Walgreens and I went in to get like one thing. I think I went in to actually get hairspray and I came out with all these things. And where we live, you have to buy bags and I didn't have a bag. So I walk out with all this stuff and she was like, what is all that? And I was like, I don't know, I got anxious. And she was like, why? And I was like, because I do not want to go to this event. And to this day, this is like 4 months ago, I have anxiety Tic Tacs in my bag that I purchased.
I feel like my palms are sweaty just after hearing that story because I related so much. It's like, for me, it feels like fake it till you make it. We've all heard that, but you never make it. Also, could include a high level of pre-planning or rehearsing, along with a high level of post-analysis / rumination, just thinking about that joke didn't land and I'll never feel the same when I see those people again. I hope I never see them again. And also, it can take a long time to recover after you're masking. Think about your kids going to school, coming home, and then like falling apart, having that like after school restraint collapse situation. It can feel like that for grown-ups too.
Oh, absolutely. This masking concept is often associated with autism, but it's actually not exclusive to autism. We see it in ADHD. And I actually, the more people that I support, I think that masking is a common experience for many, many neurodivergent profiles, not just kind of like autism or ADHD. Because basically, a lot of times what we're saying is, I am different from the norm, like the norm, let's be clear. And I'm having to suit up to like go into this, specific space. And that's hard.
So why does masking happen? Like is another question. And I think many times it's because people have maybe gotten feedback, when they're unmasked or just being their full self, authentic self. Maybe they've gotten some negative feedback and they feel like it's unsafe to be their full self, their authentic self. So I think masking can occur so that people feel safe and comfortable when they're around other people, and also to hide their quirks or things that are perceived as different so that they can be more accepted. It's like the idea of acceptability politics, but only as you show up as your human self. So not like something outside of you. It's like, hey, I feel like I have to hide parts of myself or mannerisms or my little quirks and things, my special interests. I know I've had clients who are teens or even young adults who have interests that some people would consider childish, and they feel like they have to pretend that they're not into these things because they worry about the judgment of others. So I
Mhm.
think to your point about anxiety, it's like a coping mechanism and it can be out of self-protection.
Yeah, for sure. And it can look a lot of different ways. For some people, it can be almost a constant thing. They're doing it all the time or quite frequently, especially obviously when with other people, but sometimes they even do it alone. I won't want to speak for everybody's experience, but I often hear that it for them, they feel like if they practice enough, it'll become their way of existing. It often creates more discontent and more anxiety because they're pushing down parts of themselves. But for other people it is more prevalent in certain situations than it is in other situations. Sometimes people are more masking at school, or they're more masking in places where they feel like they need to gain kind of acceptance or to kind of like get through it in some way. Sometimes it looks like really high skills. Like some people are quite good, quote unquote good at masking, meaning that they can kind of like play that role. They can do that. And then other people, when they're trying it on and they're trying to mask, it can feel a little bit or can seem kind of like robotic or like not who they are. They're not able to be as kind of like their sincere selves.
Sure.
And there's all these different ways that comes up. But one of the big things that I often see for it, the opposite of the masking, is often associated with high anxiety because there's this element of faking it, like you said earlier.
Absolutely. I relate very much to your story around going to an event, and I'm thinking about how I feel around networking, feeling like I have to mask or perform. And I use humor a lot to mask. Sometimes masking can look like being really social when actually you're an introvert. And so it's like you're using all of your resources to try to fit in, to try to like be perceived in the way that you want to be perceived. And this has been a lifetime of performing, using heavy air quotes there that you cannot see if you're not seeing the vid here. But yeah, it has me thinking about like what are the harms of masking? And I think for me, it's figuring out, well, who am I? Losing my sense of self and people pleasing so much. And I said it at the end of another episode that people pleasing, also known as fawning, is a stress response. And I think there are so many differently wired humans, especially folks assigned female at birth, who have learned that if I can just keep people happy and fly under the radar that way, get straight A's, be a pleasure to have in class, like all of those things, I think that has been our way of masking. And then we've been living in this stress response with high cortisol stress hormones coursing through our body, making our baseline for frustration tolerance get triggered more easily because we're like living in this constant state of stress because we're people pleasing, because we have learned that this is a palatable way for me to show up in society where I don't get the negative feedback. I don't feel like people will harm me if I myself. If I just say yes, if I just go along with this, then I'll be okay. So I think there are so many possibilities of harm when you are one, living in a stress response because you're people pleasing, and two, being so detached from your authentic self that I feel like can bring on just a high mental health toll. And we've been talking about anxiety and pairing that with this. And absolutely, I think it leads to increased anxiety. I run social skills groups, social groups for a lot of twice exceptional kids, kids who are gifted and also have another neurodivergence. And a lot of my clients come to me after they've gotten diagnosed with autism, like later after they're 10 years old, because they had a mental health crisis because they were masking.
Yeah. I think another harm that I sometimes see in masking is in friendship creation. Everybody edits a little bit in friendships. I talk a lot to people about how sometimes you dial up parts of your personality when you're with certain friends and you dial back parts of your personality, right? You might be more extroverted. If you have some extroversion in you, you might be more extroverted with some friends, or you might talk about certain interests because you have similar interests with some friends. That is pretty typical for all people. We tend to see that in even more so in neurodivergent people, but it is a truth for all people. But for people who are neurodivergent, what we often see is that it takes them longer to actually develop true friendships, and they tend to have some smaller friend circles. What I think is really true for so many people is actually in the process of unmasking is where they are able to have really deeper friendships. And it's because when someone is masking, we have an intuitive nature as humans to realize that there's like this barrier that's kind of there. And when we unmask, we also remove that barrier a little bit, and we're able to be more connected and more communal. So sometimes I see people masking in order to create friendship, but when they mask, they put up a barrier to the authenticity, which actually pushes that friendship a little bit further down. Again, we all do that to some extent at some points, but I think for so many neurodivergent people, they say, "Oh, to be a friend, I must be like XYZ." That isn't true.
I also think, still under the umbrella of like harms of masking, I have seen a lot of women in midlife who learn about their neurodivergence, and this is through social media, through storytelling, who have built a life around who they thought they were supposed to be and have realized, oh, wow, I'm questioning my gender presentation. I'm questioning society's demands around how I show up as this gender of a person, and or maybe I'm questioning, who I'm even attracted to. And I think that is a big harm of masking for kids who haven't had that lived experience yet, that if they are trying to build a life on what they think other people expect of them, that they could get into midlife and realize, man, I've built this house of cards around my identity that's not even really who I am. So I think as much as we can do to help our kids live authentically and also give ourselves permission to do that too. If you're like, oh, like me, learning about your neurodivergence later in life because of your kids, I know there's a lot of us out there who have that story. I think, give yourself permission to figure out what are your special interests and like spend some time figuring out who you are. Do you think masking is always bad?
That's such a good question. This might be an unpopular opinion, but no, I don't think it's always bad. I think it allows me, I'll speak for myself in my experience. It allows me to have some self protection, to create safety for myself. You can decide and what and who you disclose things to and where you shed your coat. And I think that's really important. In some ways, that can be like how you figure out where you move from acquaintance to friend. It can be a really nice way of discerning your crew versus
Yeah.
like your larger acquaintance or network. And I think everybody does that to a certain extent, but that idea of creating some self-protection, some privacy, some safety is a big deal. And it also allows you to decide what you want to disclose or, how to disclose it. I have some kids who are like, I don't want to tell this person about this. Do I have to? And my answer is always no. It is always your choice. What you disclose, if you disclose things, how you disclose them, you have that right to privacy and you have that right to self protection. So to me, no, it's definitely not always bad. I think where we tip that scale is when we feel like we cannot ever unmask.
Mm,
We don't feel like
yeah.
we have people or situations or places where we can unmask.
I like the idea that, and I use a spinal tap analogy of turning up the amps up to 11. So I love that you're doing the dialing up and down too, because I do think that I don't ever want people to not be themselves. And yet there is a nuance around how much of your authentic self do you want to share with people. And that can be based on a lot of different things. And so I think I really love that concept and that idea. And I talk about it in my work. And I don't know if people get the Spinal Tap reference, but I'm not going to stop because it's like, yeah, you can like be yourself, but notice when you can be, like your full throttle self, if you will, it's like how loud, again, air quotes here, can you be? And I think sometimes I have been really excited to connect with people and I will maybe overshare or I'll wish I could rein some things back because I end up getting hurt because I think
Mm.
maybe I'm closer to somebody than they think. And so then something will happen and my feelings get hurt. And this is, y'all, this is even as an adult. I am still working on how much of myself to share with others. Just know that this is a life lesson for many neurodivergent people around when and where and how to unmask and how much of yourself to fully share with people. Like Morgan said, you do not have to show all your cards, tell all your secrets when you're first meeting somebody because that's not expected. And you don't need to put it on 11 on the first time that you meet somebody, or second, or third, or ever.
Yeah, you could decide that. Breann, how do you help clients unmask? If you're working with them and that's something that they've decided or you guys have worked on together is like a next step, how do you help people with that?
Oh man, that's such a, I think, individual question. So again, as we always say, not everything is going to apply to everyone here, but I think self-compassion is huge. So first of all, just giving yourself a lot of love and permission, as I already said, to kind of figure out like what are you into? What are your special interests? And I think I did feel like I was playing roles. And so, can you write a role that's really you?
Mm,
And what
I like
what are
that.
you really into? And for me, it was like the first time I really felt like I unmasked was at space camp as a kid, as like a middle schooler, going so hard and so deep on like nerd stuff where I was just like, so into it and there was no hiding it. And
Mhm.
I think giving yourself permission to be okay with the fact that not everyone's going to be on board with your special interest. And like I said before, I think recently one of my kids was like, I'm 10, I'm too old for stuffed animals. And I was like, where'd you get that idea, man? One of my clients knitted me an amazing stuffed animal that in my bedroom. We're not too old for things that we liked when we were kids. That nostalgia is allowed. I mean, I got like Muppet Lego characters right behind me because Muppets Forever. I think just giving yourself permission, figuring out what fills your cup and then doing those things. And I think letting kids try things, letting people quit
Mhm.
things that they're not into, but being allowed to try things, I think is important. What do you think about helping people unmask?
I would echo everything that you're saying. I also think as parents, as therapists, as family members, I think ways that we can help are really to kind of understand a little bit more about neurodivergence, educating ourselves as partners, as parents, as friends, as therapists, so that we can kind of like walk alongside people in that journey, in whatever role, in whatever relationship we have with them. I think is really valuable because sometimes you've been living in this brain and in this body your whole life. Like sometimes you don't even like realize, and then somebody can point something out to you and be like, well, this is a really unique strength that you have, or this is
Right.
like something really cool that I notice about you. Or, it always seems like you're exhausted and cranky after this. And like it's okay to be exhausted and cranky and go and do whatever you need to do. Sometimes we just get so ingrained in like this is what I have to do, and somebody help you kind of like see it a different way, and that can be really really nice. So I think learning about different profiles, learning about neurodivergence, thinking about like how does somebody's brain work, how does their body work, how do I support their areas of interest, how do I support their areas of need, like do they need certain accommodations, or having those questions for yourself that you explore either individually or with a trusted other, I think can really help with that.
Yeah, I like that. And also like helping others to understand yourself or the kids we're raising here, like helping others understand our kids. So helping kids' classmates, their grandparents, their siblings better understand them can be really helpful, especially if you have a younger kid who they're probably with most of the same classmates all day because they're not like middle schoolers, switching classes, high schoolers. Maybe gifting the class a book about neurodivergence.
Mhm.
Shout out to one of my favorite authors, autistic authors and illustrators, Kaz Widness. She's written an awesome book called Bitsy Bat, and there's a whole series now coming out. I love it because it talks about meltdowns. And then at the end, there's this whole thing about understanding autism. Bibliotherapy, I think, which is just reading books that you can relate to, sharing that with your kids' class, making sure libraries have those books at school, that type of thing, I think can be really cool. There's just so many amazing books now and ways that we can share information than when we were kids, for sure. And beyond that, Morgan has a whole list of books. She's put a lot of work into sorting through neurodivergent affirming books. So check that out in the show notes.
Like about books too is that I don't think it's just on neurodivergent people to move towards the center of a group or of a community. I think that there is some give and some take. And so when we read books with our kids, all of our kids, not just our neurodivergent kid, in our classrooms or in our communities, however you build and support community in your life, I think it helps everybody build empathy and build understanding so that sometimes yes, like I might mask or unmask, but also somebody else could be like, oh, well, I know that so and so has this interest, so I'm going to share this book with them, or I'm going to listen to them talk about it a little bit longer. And we can both support each other. I think when we read books like that, we expand our understanding of what it means to be human, period.
Yeah, I love that. I also think it's important for kids to have at least one safe space where they can fully be themselves, some kind of space where they can show up unapologetically of themselves and people will accept them, whether they're like hiding behind the curtain because they can't join yet. No one's like, oh, what's wrong with you? It's like you're just showing up as you can. And I think if you are lucky enough to have a place like that for your kid to go, then that is also a recommendation.
I mean, I've said this before, I think, but actually the whole reason, the whole way that we ended up connecting was because I had parents who were telling me about you and your social groups. And it was because they were so different. And as I was hearing about them from my families, I was like, well, one, I need to meet this lady. And two, I think when and and two, I think like one of the reasons that they were different is that at the core, at the fundamental core of your groups is acceptance and belonging and come as you are, you're whole, right? You're not broken.
Yeah, we're not about shaming people at our groups. It's more about just showing up space where you can unmask. And that's also why I don't put kids from the same school in the same group because maybe at school you're a different person and at home you unmask or in other spaces you show up differently. And I want kids to have the permission to do that.
I think the takeaway here is look for opportunities for your child or your young adult or your partner or yourself to be authentically yourself. And if that is in a social group or if it is in some type of like specific interest that they have, it's okay, and allow that to be followed and to be treasured because it can be so important and it can be a spot for somebody to just go,
Right. Yeah. Let's not shame people for their special interests. Can we make a deal on that, everybody? Cool.
Yes, for sure. And I think too, like if you're listening to this and you're wondering if your kid is high masking, I think one, the fact that you're wondering is probably an indication, right? Two, I think you can ask, like you can say, like, are there times where you feel like you have to kind of hide or edit who you are a little bit? And do you feel like you have spaces where you can not edit and not hide who you are? And would be some ways that I sometimes ask about that. And if you are wondering or you have that conversation with your child and they say yes, that might be a clue. If you have not done evaluation, it might be a clue to consider a school-based evaluation or evaluation through a psychologist or an outside agency or a hospital. And if you're kind of wondering about that whole process, I have a course on evaluation that can walk you through those different models of support and assessment and help you figure out which one is right for you. It includes like phone scripts and note-taking templates and things like that because the process can be overwhelming.
I also think parents can get misinformation around evaluation and when it's required to get supports at schools and things like that. So if you're also like, oh, I do have these questions that Dr. Morgan is talking about, and I'm not sure what to do about this, and the school is telling me this, and their pediatrician is saying this, or maybe I'm not really sure. Check out her course. It's really awesome. She'll walk you through everything so that you can feel like you have somebody on your side because it is a daunting process to figure out. And then also it can be costly and you're trying to figure out how best to use your resources to get more information about your kid's brain. I am someone who used to be really, I still don't know how I feel about labels because I don't know if they're like all that helpful, especially when it comes to autism spectrum stuff, which is kind of where my wheelhouse. So just speaking to that point, but I think it's never bad to have more information about how your kid's brain works. And you can use that information how you want. And you
Mhm.
don't have to share it with people if you don't want to. You can follow the recommendations or not. And so I think just having more information about your kid's brain is empowering. And then you can decide what to do with it.
Yeah, as we're talking, I'm like, I feel like we should do an episode on this
I think so.
because school-based supports, I think, can be really, really valuable, and they're not the same as a diagnosis. And sometimes a diagnosis can be really valuable, especially if you're trying to get outside resources, outside supports, and having some of those maybe hopefully covered under insurance. And it can be quite a process. So to summarize, if as we're talking about masking and unmasking, you are wondering about your child, one, recognize that that wondering is probably coming from somewhere, right? There's something bubbling up for you as a parent. Two, you can always talk to your kid and ask them a little bit more about their experience humaning. Then you can decide if you want to move forward with either evaluation or talking to your school. And if you're wondering about that, stay tuned. We'll do an episode on it. But also, you can check out my course if you'd like to learn more too.
Lots of resources and show notes this episode, y'all. Check them out for sure.
Speaking of, thank you for listening. We'll have another episode out next Tuesday, and we are going to be talking about what does it mean to be neurodivergent affirming. So how to explain it to family and to friends, and how to tell if a provider is neurodivergent affirming. Whoop, whoop, shout out.
Yeah. Yep.
So